Hello, welcome to Patty and Robert's YouTube channel, where we talk about all things freelancing. I'm Robert Thompson, and I'm going to talk to you today about handling client feedback. Now, let me move the picture out of the way. Handling feedback is not always easy. It's easy to get defensive because you thought you were doing things well, or frustrated, um, or getting into a cycle of self-doubt. But feedback is part of the job. It's not a personal judgment. And you need to do a mindset shift. You need to start thinking of feedback as data, not as um, something that's attacking your identity. Top professionals use feedback as a competitive advantage. So client feedback matters because clients care about the outcomes, and not really as much about your process to get there. And the feedback aligns work with their expectations. And if you have strong feedback handling, that will build trust and referrals. Criticize Criticism can reveal blind spots and clarify their expectations. Now, one thing I do need to say is depending on the type of feedback, it can have a real impact on your Upwork um, success. If you get a bad rating in the five-star rating at the end of a job, a low rating can have a big impact on your job success score. And this is especially true if you have a limited number of large jobs rather than a lot of small jobs. So you may lose your top rated status and you may find it difficult to get new work because you're no longer above the 90%. I have had a single negative review knock my success score down into the 70s when it had been 100% prior to that. So you do have to address that, and I'll talk more about that later. Um, but remember, clients evaluate the value through result. And if you have misalignment, it's often from assumptions. You made assumptions about what they wanted, or they made assumptions about what they said and what that meant to you. Um, Feedback is communications. It's not really conflict. Um, the business impact of handling feedback. I mentioned the impact on the job success score, but anytime that you have an opportunity to respond, that strengthens relationships. And poor handling creates friction and churn. And your reputation can be shaped by those difficult moments. If you handle them well, you get more business. Now, there's several different types of client feedback. You may get constructive feedback, which is good, vague or unclear feedback, um, emotional or harsh feedback, and in some cases, misguided feedback. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these. Constructive feedback, if it's clear, specific, and actionable, it should always warrant a thoughtful response. Don't just blow it off, respond to it. And focus on what you can do to react to that feedback and follow through. I recommend developing an action plan to move forward. Vague or emotional feedback, this is a little harder to deal with. Somebody says it doesn't feel right. Well, that's hard to tell what they mean. Um, and a lot of times emotional feedback is often frustration driven. They may be angry at themselves because they thought it would be a lot quicker, or they didn't give you information that they thought they had. So look for the issue that's behind the emotion when you're getting stuff that's vague or um, negative feedback. Um, Now, there is a response framework you can use. I'll go through these all. Pause and process, acknowledge professionally, clarify and diagnose, respond with intent, and then close the loop. Um, Pausing and processing, you don't want to react immediately when somebody gives you negative feedback. You're going to be too emotional and too vested. So you want to separate the emotion from the content and focus on understanding what they're really saying. And sometimes that means stripping out their emotion as well. Acknowledge professionally, make sure they understand they've been heard, and don't be defensive. Um, but you want to acknowledge as quickly as possible so that they know you're listening and not blowing them off. Clarify and respond. Um, this is where you can really get into what does the feedback mean, especially if it's vague um, or unwarranted. You want to ask targeted questions that allow you to figure out what's really going on and get down to the root issue rather than the surface comments. And then agree on what needs to change and explain what's makes sense and maybe, what some of their um, people's input had in terms of its effect. So you really need to understand the problem and focus on outcomes, not on ego. And then finally, you want to close the loop. You want to confirm your next steps. You want to reinforce that alignment. You want to show them that you have been doing changes based on their feedback, and then summarize those changes and the timelines so that they know about the impact. Now, if you get a negative Upwork rating, this usually happens at the end, and sometimes you don't get an opportunity to respond because the way Upwork works is you do a rating, they do a rating, and then you get to see each other's ratings. Um, and I had one client that gave me a very negative rating. I mean, in the threes, not a zero, but for me, very negative. It was the first time I didn't have 100%. And that didn't come until the very end after we had done that. Now, as it turned out, the client had written up a spreadsheet that they thought explained everything they needed, but that really wasn't very clear in my mind. And so I did a quick run through of it and said, this is what I understand this to be and that to be. Well, they didn't want to have to answer questions on that. And on a Monday, I got a note say, stop working on it. I decided to just spend my weekend to do the project myself. And, you know, that's it. So that's a negative one. And that one's hard to respond to. Now, maybe I could have reached out to that client, and I probably should have in hindsight. In some cases, they're willing to change their rating, especially if you explain the impact of what they did with the ratings. Um, you can refuse payment. I've seen this as a suggestion. It erases the job from the history because if you never got paid, the job didn't exist on your list of jobs. But it doesn't affect your job success score. It's the negative rating still factored into your JSS. So it's not much help. Um, you can contact Upwork for help, but for the most part, what I've found is they're only really interested if there's fraud, um, not as much in your particular rating. Um, so how do you recover? Uh, Really, the only way out is to get more five-star jobs. And we have some videos talking about how to get five-star jobs that you can get quickly. You do a bunch of them and your job success score will come back up. Um, You want to turn feedback into growth. Look for recurring themes. If you're hearing the same thing from multiple clients, it may mean that something needs to change on your side. Identify processes or skill gaps, something that you're doing wrong. Improve your onboarding and communications. Make sure those expectations are understood up front, not at the end. And build feedback checkpoints into the workflows so you don't get 3 weeks into a project before you realize you're off track. When you have a difficult situation, you want to stay objective, even though the feedback may seem unfair. You can disagree calmly and professionally. Um, Unless it's at the very end like that and you don't get that opportunity. Don't respond emotionally. That just is a race to the bottom. And you want to distinguish corrections from scope creep. Sometimes people will say, well, you missed this, which was not in the original work at all. So you need to be careful and control that scope creep, even if it's formed in this, in the cloak of feedback. So you want to have a feedback positive experience, set the expectations early, make the feedback easy to provide, um, respond consistently and professionally, don't let stuff sit, and show visible progress from the feedback. Hmm. Tongue-tied this morning. And so finally, how you handle feedback often matters more than the work itself. I had one client where I had done good work. Um, they had asked for several enhancements, and I had agreed to, but I was working hourly. So, of course, that took additional time. And then a month later, I get a note from the head of the project who said, wait a minute, how did we wind up spending so much money? We're way over budget. And, so I was able to respond with examples of what they had asked for that was extra work and how much time I spent on each of those so that they could understand it wasn't just that suddenly there was hours tied on, it was a additional functionality. And after that, they gave me a 5-star review. Um, so for you, I would say identify one recent feedback insight and work through how to apply it. Even if it was for a client that you've already closed out, think what you could have done to apply that feedback. So that's it for today. Check out our next video. And if you need coaching, we're always available. You can contact us at info@rptvirtualservices.com or check out the blog on our website. So till next week, have a great week.